Forget white dresses and church bells. Viking weddings were a wild mix of tradition, magic, and power. From brides washing their hair in streams to grooms breaking swords as part of the ceremony, every ritual carried deep meaning. Today, we'll uncover what weddings were really like in Viking times, including surprising customs that shaped love, family, and alliances. Stick around, because beyond the wedding day, we'll explore more fascinating secrets of Viking weddings. What weddings were like in Viking times were never affairs of lace and quiet whispers. They were storms of kinship, of names carried like banners, of honour balanced like a blade's edge. A wedding in the north was not simply about a man and a woman, nor about love, as the skalds might spin it in softer verses. It was a binding of farms, a stitching together of bloodlines, and a gamble played in the sight of gods and men alike. The Viking people knew that their names did not belong only to themselves. A name was a chain, reaching back through forefathers and forward into children yet unborn. When a man sought a bride, he was not only judged for the breadth of his shoulders or the strength of his sword arm. He was measured for the weight of his kin, the worth of his farm, and the steadiness of the name he carried into the hall. For a Viking man, the question was never, "Whom do you love?" but "What do you bring?" A marriage bound not just two souls, but entire families and the honour of their ancestors. Reputation mattered more than silk or coin. If a farm was well kept, its fences stout, its cattle healthy, and its mead plentiful, it carried more weight than 1,000 whispered verses of affection. No father would give his daughter to a man whose kin were known for breaking oaths, or whose uncles had stirred blood feuds across fjords. To wed such a man was to invite ruin to one's hearth. It was common for a Viking child to grow under the shadow of these ties long before talk of betrothal. A boy might be fostered in another household, learning not only skills of sword and plough, but weaving bonds between families. These foster ties were more than hospitality. They were hidden threads, binding clans together. When the time came for a wedding, these ties could prove stronger than gold. A foster brother's loyalty might win a bride where coin alone could not. Names themselves were tokens of fate. To carry the name of a grandfather who had fallen in battle, or of a grandmother famed for her wisdom, was to walk beneath their shadow and their protection. In the sagas, when a bride was chosen, the skald would recite lineages like rivers flowing back into mist, proving that neither party entered the union rootless. Without such proof, a wedding would carry no honour, for what Viking wished to bind himself to a family whose tree bore only weak or withered branches? Honour was the spine of it all. To insult a man's name at the feast was to risk steel flashing before dawn. To marry poorly was to invite whispers, and whispers were poison. Even gifts, those precious tokens exchanged at the wedding bench, spoke louder than kisses. A sword hilted in silver, a cloak clasped with bronze, a carved chest filled with fine linen. These were signs that the union was not only lawful, but worthy. Thus, when the villagers gathered, when the bride with her keys and the groom with his oaths stood before kin, they knew the weight upon their shoulders. A Viking wedding was not simply a joining of two. It was the forging of a chain name to name, kin to kin, honour to honour. And in that chain lay the strength of the clan, the safety of the farm, and the whisper of the gods who watched. For in the north, marriage was not a dream but a destiny. Finding a match in the Old North was never left to chance, nor was it the soft affair of wandering hearts. It was a matter of whispers and wagers, of go-betweens weaving threads as carefully as a loom maid with her shuttle. When folk spoke of finding a match, go-betweens and gossip, they meant the steady hum of alliances being shaped in smoky halls, the hushed voices by firelight, and the sudden burst of laughter when the first hint of a union passed through the ears of the village. To a Viking man or woman, marriage was not only a step into adulthood, but the laying of foundations for farm, family, and future power. The go-between was the weaver of these fates, a man or woman trusted to carry words across fjords, from farm to farm, bringing offers wrapped not only in words but in honour. He would sit by the hearth of one house, listen to the pride of cattle and kin, and then carry those same boasts to another hall, shaping them into promises. Such a figure was both respected and feared, for a misplaced word could break a bargain or light a feud. To call upon a go-between was to admit the weight of marriage. It was not a private matter, but a negotiation that touched every relative and ancestor. Yet gossip played as strong a hand as any envoy. A Viking child might grow up hearing tales of another across the water, a girl said to be tall and fair, a boy known for his strength in the games of winter. By the time these children were of age, the gossip had already written their reputations. At feasts, tongues wagged faster than the mead flowed. Who had good land? Who had steady sheep? Who had been seen with a wandering eye? This chorus of talk was not idle. It guided choices, guarded secrets, and sometimes doomed a match before it began. Winter gatherings were the crucible of these decisions. When the snow lay heavy and the fjords groaned with ice, families gathered under one roof for the long nights. It was here, by torchlight, and with tables groaning under Viking food, boiled meat, bread, and mead, that young men and women were watched closely. A glance across the benches, a laugh too long, a hand that lingered on a drinking horn, all were noticed. Mothers whispered to mothers, fathers weighed cattle against cattle, and old men remembered debts owed. In those nights, when skalds sang and fires roared, matches were often sealed with nothing more than nods and knowing looks, the words to be carried later by the go-between. Traders, too, brought more than silver and amber. They carried stories, hints of daughters across the sea, of sons whose farms were rich with grain. A Viking man might first hear of his bride from a merchant's tale, her beauty described alongside the measure of her father's ships. These stories travelled as swiftly as gulls, and many a union began not with love at first sight, but with the calculated weight of rumour. So it was that marriage in the Viking world began long before vows were spoken. It began in the murmur of neighbours, in the laughter of halls, in the careful work of go-betweens, and the restless wagging of tongues. For in a land where honour and survival walked hand in hand, no match was small. Every marriage was a bargain struck between past and future, a weaving of kinship that might guard the farm in winters to come, or tear it apart if whispers turned to war. Terms on the table: munder, dowry, and morning gift. These were the three stones upon which a Viking wedding stood, as solid and weighty as any runestone carved in the fields. Without them, no marriage was binding, no union respected, no honour preserved. To the Viking man seeking a bride, it was not enough to show his strength at the oars or his courage with the sword. He had to place silver, land, or livestock upon the table, a bride price known as the munder. And this was not simply a payment, but a measure of worth, a public declaration that he valued the woman, her kin, and the bond between them. A man without means could not marry well, no matter how broad his shoulders or how many enemies he had slain. The munder was agreed upon by guardians, fathers, brothers, uncles, the men of the bride's kin, who carried the right to grant or deny her hand. It was not handed to her directly, but to her family, for in their eyes she was a treasure of lineage. Yet it was not barter alone. The munder also ensured that the union was lawful, that no child born of the bed would be deemed illegitimate. To refuse it was to question the man's honour. To give it too lightly was to insult the worth of the bride. But silver from the groom's side was not the only gift. The bride carried with her the hymen filger, the dowry, drawn from her father's household. Chests of linen, carved boxes, farm tools, livestock, sometimes even land, all were sent with her as she crossed the threshold into a new home. These were not luxuries, but the tools of survival, the bones of a household's strength. A Viking child might grow up under a roof built by beams once included in his mother's dowry, or eat from bowls that came with her hand. The dowry was her anchor, proof that she came not empty-handed, but as a bearer of her kin's fortune. Then there was the third pillar, the morgengifu, the morning gift. Unlike the mundra or dowry, it came after the union had been sealed, given by the husband to his wife at dawn following the first night. This was hers alone, not to be claimed by father or brother, but to rest in her keeping as her safeguard. It might be land, gold, or fine jewellery, but always it was meant to honour her place in the marriage. In a world where Viking women held keys at their belts, the morning gift was more than ornament. It was her weapon of independence, wealth she could claim if widowed, protection against misfortune. The three together formed a web of obligations and rights. The mundra showed the man's seriousness, the dowry bore the weight of her kin, and the morning gift secured her dignity. Without these, whispers would rise in the hall, wagging tongues would brand the marriage unlawful, and children born of it would inherit shadows instead of honour. These exchanges of wealth were not cold commerce, they were heavy with meaning. Each gift was a promise, each object a fragment of the future. A sword given might one day defend the household. A cow in the dowry might feed generations. A ring in the morning gift might be clasped in a widow's hand as she claimed her rights. So when the people of the village gathered and the tables creaked beneath platters of Viking food, the talk was not only of feasting, but of terms agreed upon. Every horn of ale raised was also a witness to those silent contracts. In the smoke of the hearth and the murmur of kin, the weight of these three pillars was felt, binding man and woman, clan and clan, not only for that night, but for lifetimes yet to come. Guardians and consent were at the very heart of Viking unions, the unseen hands guiding who could be joined, and whose names would be bound together for generations. In the world of the North, a woman did not walk to the bridal bench unshielded. Behind her stood her kin father, brothers, uncles, and sometimes foster guardians, each with a voice in the bargain. To them, marriage was no private flame of desire, but a contract that could raise the standing of their farm or drag their honour into the mud. The guardians bore the weight of consent, and in Viking law it was they who spoke first, their word carrying the weight of iron. Yet to believe the bride herself was without a voice is to misread the sagas. Time and again, stories tell of Viking women whose silence or speech determined the fate of matches. A bride might not sit at the table with the men as they haggled over dowry and bride price, but when her voice was finally sought, it mattered. If she stood mute, eyes turned to the ground. Her reluctance became a stone in the path. If she spoke with clear words, the union gained strength, for it was believed that a marriage without her spoken assent could unravel in shame. Guardianship was not cruelty, but duty. A father was bound to protect the honour of his daughter as he guarded the gates of his stead. To wed her poorly was to weaken his line, to strip her of the protection of good kin, and to invite scorn upon his hall. Thus the guardians weighed every suitor like gold in a scale. Was the Viking man's name clean? Did his kin pay their debts? Were his hands calloused by work or bloodied by feud? Only when these questions were answered would the talk move to dowry and morning gift. But the North was a land of witnesses, and no marriage could be hidden in dark corners. Consent had to be spoken in the open, before kin and community. A promise made without ears to hear, it was no promise at all. The sagas tell of thresholds where brides were asked plainly, "Do you take this man?" and their answer carried before all. To deny in public was to strike a blow at the pride of both families, and to assent was to seal the bond with unshakable force. In this way, consent was hard to fake. A father could push, an uncle could glare, but if the bride refused before witnesses, the weight of law leaned with her. Still, there were shadows between words and silences. A stern father might remind his daughter of obligations, of dowries already exchanged, of brothers who expected her compliance. At times, The sagas whisper of women wed against their will, their protests brushed aside. Yet even then, the law remembered. If a woman could later prove she had not given consent, if witnesses recalled her silence, the union could be broken, and shame cast upon the man who pressed her hand without her voice. Thus, Viking weddings were not simply tales of feasting and gifts. They were trials of honour, where guardians bore the burden of judgment, and brides bore the courage to speak or remain silent before their world. In smoky halls and churchyards alike, the word yes or the shadow of refusal echoed long after the feast had ended. And it was that word, spoken before kin, neighbours, and gods, that bound the future tighter than any ring of bronze or clasp of silver. Oaths and the law, thing, rings, and witnesses were the spine of every union, the iron that held words firm when wine faded and songs grew quiet. In the world of the North, love might spark a match, kin might weigh gifts, but it was oaths that made a wedding lawful. Without an oath sworn and witnessed, a union was as fragile as mist above the fjord. A Viking man might boast of his bride, a Viking woman might wear the keys of her new household, but unless their promises were anchored in law, tongues would wag, children would be doubted, and honour would crumble like rotten timber. The thing, the great assembly, where law was spoken and disputes settled, was more than a gathering of farmers and jarls. It was the furnace where oaths were forged. Beneath the open sky, with the gods as silent overseers, men swore vows that bound not just themselves, but their kin. To wed without the tenning's shadow upon the promises was folly, for only there could disputes be answered with law rather than blood. A father who doubted the dowry, a brother who claimed insult, a neighbour who whispered scandal, all these could be silenced if the vows were spoken where law was heard. Central to this was the temple ring, a great band of sacred metal kept at the high seat of the god's house, or carried by the law speaker himself. When a man set his hand upon that ring, he did not merely bind himself to his bride, he bound himself before Odin, before Thor, before Freya. To break such an oath was to invite the wrath of gods and men alike. The sagas tell of warriors who kept faith in battle, but were shunned forever because they broke wedding oaths sworn on the ring. To lie before gods was worse than cowardice, it was to stain one's name for all time. But even sacred rings were powerless without witnesses. The law demanded two, often more, men of standing who could swear that they had seen and heard the promises made. These witnesses were not idle onlookers. They were shields against falsehood, the living memory of the moment when bride and groom declared their bond. In a world where runes carved on wood could be burned and silver stolen in the night, it was living voices that mattered. A witness could stand at the thing years later and say, "I heard the bride say yes, I saw the groom swear on the ring," and his word would end the quarrel. Witnesses gave weight where poetry could not. A skald might sing of love, a hall might cheer the pair, but such words could not be laid before the law. Only sworn oaths and named witnesses could anchor a marriage, protecting the children who came after and the property that would pass through their hands. Without this, a wife might be dismissed as a concubine, her sons as bastards, her dowry stolen. With it, she stood, shielded by the law, her honour safe. Thus, the strength of a Viking marriage did not rest on feasting or festivity, but on the firmness of oaths. Beneath the cold eyes of gods, before the stern ears of neighbours, a man and woman spoke binding words. And when those words were held fast by rings and witnesses, no storm, no feud, no drunken boast could undo them. For in the North, to swear was to live by the weight of one's word, and to wed was to make that word eternal. Choosing the day, seasons, omens, and the gods was never a matter left to chance in the Viking world. To the men and women of the North, a wedding was not just a feast of kin and cattle, it was a joining, watched by unseen powers, and to choose poorly was to invite ruin. A Viking man might have his dowry settled, a Viking woman her bridal keys ready at her belt, but if the day itself bore the mark of ill fate, all could wither. Time was as sacred as place, and the gods spoke not only through storm and steel, but through the turning of seasons and the whispers of birds. The most favoured days were those close to winter nights, when the harvest was gathered and the fields lay bare beneath the first frosts. This was the season when larders swelled with Viking food, when mead foamed in vats, and when folk had time to celebrate before winter's long shadow pressed them indoors. Freya, goddess of love and fruitfulness, was thought to look kindly on weddings in this season, blessing the couple with children and fertile fields. To wed, then, was to step into marriage with the scent of full barns and the promise of abundance in the air. But even within good seasons, omens had to be read. No man wished to have his vows drowned out by sudden storm, nor to see ravens circling above the bridal yard. The flight of birds was watched with sharp eyes. If swans crossed the fjord in calm grace, it was a sign of peace to come. If owls called in daylight, the hall grew uneasy. Clouds, too, spoke their language. High, clear skies promised joy, while sudden mist could be read as the veiling of luck. Families delayed weddings when such signs appeared, for to begin a union under a dark omen was to risk sorrow. The gods themselves marked time, and their favour mattered. To wed on a day sacred to Thor was to ask his hammer to shield the home, to drive away envy and ill will. To choose a day tied to Freya was to invite love, though with her came the sharp reminder that love and war were never far apart. Odin's days were often avoided, for his gifts came with riddles, and his blessings were heavy with trial. A cautious father weighed these choices carefully, for he knew that his daughter's fate could hinge on which god's shadow stretched across the bridal yard. Ill-starred days were spoken of in hushed tones. The sagas tell of unions begun on unlucky tides, when men sailed to fetch their brides only to vanish beneath sudden storms. Days of death feasts, anniversaries of slayings, or those marked by eclipses, were shunned, for no one wished to tether new life to memories of loss. Even a Viking child, playing by the hearth, might overhear such talk and learn early that marriage was not simply about love, but about reading the language of fate. Thus, to choose the day of a Viking wedding was to stand between earth and sky, listening to gods, to birds, to whispers of weather. It was to take counsel with kin, to weigh the signs, to be patient when omens turned ill. And when the right day finally dawned, clear and blessed, the hall doors would swing wide, fires would be lit, and the vows spoken would carry not just the strength of law, but the favour of the unseen powers who watched the north. For in that world, no wedding was complete unless the very day itself had agreed. Preparing the house, benches, beds, and beer was no small matter in the north, for a Viking wedding was measured as much by the strength of its feast as by the oaths sworn beneath the roof. When word spread that a bride was to be brought into a household, every hand turned to the work of readiness. The longhouse itself became a stage upon which honour would be displayed, and no man wished to be shamed for poor benches, sour beer, or weak fare when the kin of his bride came to judge his worth. First came the benches. In the smoky length of the hall, places were marked with care, for seating was not a trifle. The high seat was reserved for the groom, flanked by his closest kin, while the bride's family claimed places of equal honour opposite. Lesser folk, cousins, farmers, and neighbours, filled the lower benches, their places still vital, for even the humblest Viking man held weight as a witness to vows. Fresh rushes were spread on the floor, and the benches were scrubbed, polished with fat until they gleamed in the glow of firelight. To sit in order was to know one's place, and to be seated wrongly could spark insult and feud before the first horn of ale was poured. Beds were no less important. The bridal bed was not left as it had been, but remade with care, layered with the best furs and the whitest linens a household could muster. Mothers and sisters of the groom stitched and washed, weaving their blessing into every fold. To the Viking bride, those linens were more than cloth. They were a promise of care, a sign that she was to be honoured in her new home. In sagas, much is made of the bed prepared for the couple, for it was the hearthstone of the marriage itself. If the bed was poorly made, the union was said to carry misfortune. If the bed shone with care, then prosperity would follow. And then there was the matter of beer. Brewing was a task planned weeks ahead, for no Viking feast could pass without foaming horns passed from hand to hand. Women stirred the vats, tending the mash with patience, while the yeasts worked their hidden craft. The air of the house filled with the sweet, sharp scent of fermenting grain. To serve weak beer was to shame the host. To serve strong and plentiful ale was to gild his name for seasons to come. It was said that a hall where the beer ran deep was a hall beloved of the gods. No feast, however, was complete without the slaughter of the wedding ox. This beast, fattened through summer and guarded through winter, was chosen for the day when kin would gather. Its flesh fed the multitude, its hide sometimes offered as a gift, and its blood could be sprinkled in blessing over bride and groom. To carve the wedding ox was to show plenty, a sign that the household was rich enough to share, bold enough to give, and secure enough to feed many mouths without fear of hunger. Viking food piled high on boards, roasted meat, boiled cuts, steaming broth, was proof that the house was ready to bear the weight of a new family. Thus, when guests arrived, stamping snow from their boots, they entered a hall prepared with reverence. Benches gleamed, beds were made, vats of beer foamed in readiness, and the smell of ox meat filled the rafters. In such a place, under such a roof, words spoken and vows sworn held greater weight, for the house itself bore witness. And it was said that a well-prepared hall gave strength to the marriage, binding not only man and woman, but every guest who sat and feasted beneath its beams. For in Viking times, a wedding was not only a union of people, but of hearth, hall, and home. The bridal keys and household power were not trinkets to glitter at a woman's belt, nor ornaments to please the eye. They were the weight of authority, the mark of trust, the silent proclamation that the bride had stepped into her place as mistress of the hall. When a Viking woman walked into her husband's longhouse for the first time, the clink of keys at her waist was as telling as the clash of a Viking man's sword. One guarded life outside the walls, the other safeguarded the life within. At the wedding feast, before benches filled and horns were drained, the handing of keys was among the most solemn gestures. A chest was brought forth, heavy with the dowry she carried, filled with linen, ornaments, or the tools of her craft. Yet alongside this chest came another, the household chest, which belonged not to her father nor her husband, but now to her alone. Into this chest went the valuables of the family cloth, jewellery, silver coins, and the hoarded goods that meant survival when winters pressed hard. The key to this chest, hung at her girdle, was more than metal. It was her sceptre, her seal of rule. In sagas, women with keys are often described as keepers of the hall. Their authority stretched beyond chests and storerooms. They ruled the flow of Viking food, they commanded servants, they judged when to open the ale barrels and when to keep them closed. A careless woman might squander stores, and her name would fall into mockery. A wise one, however, could stretch a sack of grain through famine, could ensure that no guest went hungry and no kin felt slighted. The respect given to such women was not soft praise, but hard acknowledgement of power. A Viking child, running through the smoky hall, would know the sound of his mother's keys before he saw her face. The ring at her side might carry 5 or 10 iron pieces, each one shaped for a chest, a storeroom, a granary, or a hidden box beneath the bed. Even warriors hardened from raids bowed their heads when the woman of the house turned those keys, for she commanded what sustained their strength. The bride's power was not only practical, but symbolic. The giving of keys marked her shift from daughter to wife, from one hearth to another. Her kin sent her forth with goods, but her husband's kin received her as the new shield over their stores. She alone could open the chest of linen for guests, measure silver for trade, or grant servants their tasks. In this way, the Longhouse bore two rulers, the man who wielded axe and spear, and the woman whose keys governed survival when weapons slept. It is said in tales that a marriage without the clink of keys was no marriage at all, but a theft, a bond without blessing. To see a bride step into the hall with keys shining at her belt was to know she held honour, authority, and the trust of both families. And so, in the hush before the feasting, when the firelight gleamed on iron and the bride lowered her hand to rest on her keys, all knew that the household itself had spoken. She was now its heart, its keeper, and its strength. Hair, veil, and dress carried more meaning in the Viking world than jewels of kings or cloaks of jarls. A Viking bride was not merely adorned for beauty, but transformed, stepping from one state of life into another. Her hair, her coverings, the very cloth upon her shoulders, told the story of who she had been and who she was now. When the day of the wedding dawned, the first eyes upon the bride did not look to her smile or her step, but to the crown of her head, for there, in strands of hair, lay the language of womanhood. Loose hair marked a maiden. Flowing down her back like river water, it spoke of freedom, of youth not yet bound. A Viking child would grow seeing his sisters with uncovered locks, knowing that so long as their hair was unbound, they walked as daughters beneath their father's care. On the wedding day, that same hair, combed, brushed, sometimes braided with care, was left long until the vows were spoken. The moment it was veiled or bound was the moment the woman ceased to be maiden and became wife, mistress of keys and hearth. In this act lay power, for hair was more than ornament, it was the vessel of change. The veil, or head covering, was no simple cloth. Some sagas speak of linen, white and plain, tied modestly beneath the chin. Others hint at silk, rare and costly, carried home from raids or bought from traders across the seas. To cover the head was to show dignity, modesty, and authority. A married Viking woman unveiled was a woman untethered, veiled, she proclaimed to all her new station. Archaeology finds fragments of woolen caps, woven bands, and delicate pins of bronze or silver, suggesting that no single form prevailed, but each hall, each clan, each woman had her own way of showing the shift. The dress itself was both simple and rich. Wool formed the bones of it, dyed in colours coaxed from plants, deep reds from madder, blues from woad, browns and greens from bark and moss. Over this woolen shift was laid the apron dress, fastened at the shoulders with brooches, often oval in shape and decorated with knotwork. These brooches were more than adornment. They anchored beads of glass, amber, or even silver, strung across the chest in loops. Amber, especially, was favoured, glowing with the warmth of northern shores. To wear amber was to carry a piece of the sea's fire, and many a Viking bride gleamed with such treasure as she walked into her new life. Fur, too, played its part, for no season was spared the cold. A bride might wear the white of winter animals, or the darker pelts of fox and marten, trimmed along cloak or hem. To those gathered, the sight of fur was not mere decoration, but proof that the household could clothe its women against the biting winds. Shoes of leather, stitched and simple, were sometimes hidden beneath long skirts, though a wealthier bride might have them worked with dyed threads or bound with bronze buckles. Yet, for all these fragments, cloth, brooch, bead, fur, the truth still slips between saga and soil. The storytellers painted scenes of women clad in grace, while the ground gives us bones and beads but little fabric. Much remains guesswork, woven from scraps of wool found in graves and the echoes of verses sung by skalds. Still, the heart of it is clear. Hair bound or unbound, head veiled or uncovered, cloth plain or adorned, all spoke to those who watched, telling them that the woman before them had crossed a threshold. Thus, when the Viking bride walked into the hall, her hair shining loose for the last time, her dress heavy with beads and brooches, her veil waiting to be placed. She was more than herself. She was the vessel of kinship, the bearer of change, the figure through whom households and histories intertwined. And when the veil at last settled upon her head, all knew the moment had come. The maiden was gone, the wife had arrived, and the hall itself seemed to hush in recognition of the new power seated among them. The hammer and the lap was no idle gesture, no quaint superstition whispered among women at the loom. It was a ritual as weighty as iron, one that carried the very breath of the gods into the hall on the day of union. In the dim glow of the hearth, when the feasting had quieted and the bride sat before kin and neighbours, there came the solemn moment when Thor's hammer, whether an actual likeness of Mjolnir or a sacred token carved in silver or wood, was laid upon her lap. To those gathered, this was no mere ornament. It was the blessing of the Thunderer himself, a call for fruitfulness, for luck, and for the unyielding strength that guarded a home. Thor was the god of the common folk, beloved by farmer and thrall, by Viking man and Viking child alike. His hammer was no symbol of tyranny, but of protection, smashing the heads of giants as surely as it sanctified the hearth. To bring Mjolnir into the wedding was to invite his shield around the new household. As the hammer rested upon the bride's lap, eyes turned solemn, for all knew the act reached beyond the hall. It called on the god to drive off envy, malice, and ill luck, the unseen foes as dangerous as any axe. There is tale told of Thrymskvitha, when giants stole Thor's hammer and demanded Freya as bride. Thor himself, in disguise, took the bride's seat, with the hammer laid upon his lap to bless the union. Though a jest of the scolds, it revealed a truth the people clung to, that no wedding was complete until Mjolnir touched the bride's lap, its weight pressing promise into her womb, its power sealing the union against spite. Thus, what began in myth was mirrored in the hall, as if every Viking couple replayed the god's own drama to ensure their marriage was no less guarded. Some households invoked Thor at the board instead, raising the hammer above the ale horn before passing it to the bride and groom. In this act, drink and deity mingled, as the couple shared the sanctified cup. To drink beneath the shadow of Mjolnir was to bind their fates as firmly as iron chains. It was said that those who skipped this blessing risked barren fields, childless years, or quarrelsome unions. None wished to tempt such doom, so the hammer was always present, its shape shining in metal, carved in wood, or scratched into stone. The hammer on the lap was not only for fertility, but also for luck. A Viking bride, flushed with firelight, might bow her head as the token rested against her skirts, knowing that from this day her womb carried the weight of kin's hopes. The women of the hall would murmur blessings, and the men would nod in approval, for in that moment they saw more than a bride, they saw the mother of heirs, the keeper of their name. And so the ritual endured, year after year, hall after hall. It was as binding as oaths at the Thing, as vital as the bridal keys, as sacred as the morning gift. For in a world of storm and sword, the hammer's presence whispered that even in the clash of fate, there was one who guarded the home. To lay Thor's hammer on the bride's lap was to set the new household upon stone, firm against envy, fertile beneath heaven, and shielded by the god whose thunder rolled across every fjord. Procession through the yard was the moment when the wedding shifted from private vow to public triumph. After oaths were sworn and blessings spoken, the union could not simply fade into the shadows of the hall. It had to be proclaimed, carried in sound, fire, and steel through the open air so that gods, spirits, and men alike would recognize it. A Viking wedding without a procession was like a feast without ale, empty, incomplete, and lacking the thunder that gave it life. The bride, her veil resting heavy and her keys clinking at her belt, stepped forth from the threshold, with kin around her. In her hands she might carry a token, sometimes bread, sometimes a branch, to mark her as the bringer of life and order into the household she was entering. The groom, standing at her side, was flanked by brothers, cousins, and sworn friends, each armed as if marching to war. Their axes glinted, their shields caught the torchlight, and their presence sent a clear message. This marriage was not to be mocked, interrupted, or challenged. Torches flared as the procession wound its way through the yard. Fire was more than light. It was a ward against lurking spirits and a beacon to the watching gods. Flames leapt high into the dark sky, carrying with them the breath of celebration, as though the very smoke bore the news of union to the halls of Asgard. The crackle of pine torches mingled with the rhythm of boots, stamping the frozen earth or wet grass, a cadence both joyful and grim, reminding all that beneath laughter lay readiness for battle. Noise was not an accident. The skalds tell us that quiet processions invited mischief. Spirits might slip close, whispering ill luck into the ears of bride or groom, while envious neighbours could mutter curses if no one drowned them out. So the Vikings sang loud, rowdy, unashamed, verses of old victories, bawdy refrains, even improvised lines, mocking rival clans, all poured into the night air. The clash of shields with spear shafts kept time like a drum, a sound both celebratory and threatening. A Viking child, clinging to his mother's cloak, would remember such noise all his life, the hall erupting outward, fire, song, and steel marching as one. This escort was more than theatre, it was defence. In times of feud, a bride could be stolen, a wedding raided by enemies seeking insult or leverage. To march with armed men around the new couple was to declare, "Here stands strength. Touch them at your peril." Even the unseen were challenged by it, for laughter and shouting were thought to drive away wandering spirits jealous of the living. As the couple circled the yard or walked to a sacred spot, a stone, a tree, a mound, the whole community became part of the act. Elders muttered blessings, women lifted their voices in songs, and children danced in the torchlight, chasing shadows like sprites of joy. By the time the couple re-entered the hall, they were no longer merely man and woman, but husband and wife proclaimed to earth and sky, guarded by kin, watched by gods, and celebrated in fire and thunder. The procession through the yard was the heartbeat of the wedding, a blend of fear and festivity, steel and song. It told all who listened that this household had been forged, that its walls would be defended, and that its joy had been hammered into the night, with voices too strong for envy or ill luck to break. In the eyes of the Vikings, a union loudly proclaimed was a union doubly blessed. Blood, blot, and blessing was the core of a Viking wedding, the moment when the union was pulled from the realm of men and placed firmly beneath the gaze of powers greater than themselves. Oaths and gifts might bind families, but without blessing, a marriage felt hollow, unshielded, as if wolves lurked at its door. To the Viking mind, the gods must be called, the land must be honoured, and even the restless spirits must be appeased, lest envy and misfortune creep into the new household. In the elder days, before the cross was carried into the north, the Hout Bowl stood at the centre of this sacred act. Within it lay the blood of the sacrificial beast, sometimes the wedding ox, sometimes a boar, sometimes a goat chosen for its strength. The blood was not wasted, but held as a channel, a raw and living tie between men and the gods. A priest or chieftain dipped the hout twig, often fashioned from evergreen, into the steaming bowl, then sprinkled the bride, the groom, and the gathered kin. Droplets spattered clothing, faces and hair, and far from shrinking away, folk welcomed it, for this blood was luck. It was the gods' own mark of approval, the mingling of life that sealed the promise of new life to come. The blot, the sacrifice itself, filled the air with smoke and sanctity. Flesh was carved and shared at the feast, while bones and offal were burned or buried, given back to the powers that watched over field and fjord. A Viking man, drinking from the horn afterward, did not taste only ale but the very essence of the rite, his throat warmed by fire, his belly filled with sanctified food. For the bride, too, the sprinkling was more than symbol. It tied her womb to the fertility of the land, made her a vessel not just for children, but for the fortune of the household. When Christ's priests came to the north, the form of the rite changed, yet its heart did not. The halt bowl gave way to the font, the halt twig to the cross, and blood to holy water. Still, the bride and groom stood waiting for the sprinkle that marked them as blessed. The priest raised prayers, instead of invocations to Thor or Freya, and yet the people understood marriage demanded a seal from beyond mortal hands. Without it, the union felt brittle, as though one strong wind could break it. In some sagas, we hear of blended rites, where a family unwilling to offend either God or Christ invited both blessing and prayer. A Viking child might see his parents sprinkled with blood one year, and his sister veiled beneath the sign of the cross the next. But whether it was ox blood or sanctified water, fire to Thor or a hymn to Christ, the need was constant. The couple must be blessed. It was said that envy feared blessing, that ill fate drew back when hall, bride, and groom were marked with it. Thus, the moment of blood, blot, and blessing lingered in memory long after the feasting horns were drained. It was the breath of the gods upon the household, a shield unseen yet deeply felt, without which no Viking marriage could truly begin. The binding of hands was the moment when two lives, two lineages, and two fates were fastened into one. The oaths had been spoken, the blessings given, but words alone could drift away like smoke in the rafters. What endured was the knot, the physical sign that the union was now bound by law, by luck, and by the eyes of gods and men. To watch the joining of hands was to witness the very heart of the wedding, for in that gesture the Viking people saw the weaving of their world. When the time came, the bride and groom stood before their kin, facing one another, their palms pressed together. Sometimes it was the priest, sometimes a chieftain, sometimes the oldest kinsman present who took up the band of cloth or cord. It might be a strip of linen woven by the bride's mother, or a length of wool dyed bright for the occasion, or even the groom's own belt symbols chosen with care, for each carried meaning. The cloth was looped once, twice, or even 3 times about their hands, tying them so they could not part without breaking the fabric. In that knot lay permanence. The language itself revealed the weight of the act. In the sagas, marriage is spoken of as to take a woman and to give a woman. But these were not mere gestures of possession. They were legal, public, binding. The father or guardian gave the bride, acknowledging the dowry and the terms agreed upon. The groom took her, not as plunder or spoil, but as partner and keeper of his house. The knot drawn around their joined hands made the words flesh, for all who saw it knew that what was given and taken could not easily be undone. It was said, too, that the binding held luck, a knot tied, well promised that fortune would cling to the household, that children would come, that wealth would grow. A knot tied poorly, slipping loose too soon, was taken as an ill omen, a warning whispered by the Norns themselves. Some tales tell of nervous bridesmaids or careful priests checking the cloth twice, tugging it firm so that luck would not unravel with it. A Viking child watching would later recall the sight, the cord snug about his mother's hand, and know in his bones that this was when his family's story began. Not all bindings were gentle. In times of feud or wary alliances, the knot carried the weight of politics. Men whispered that a forced marriage might be seen in the grip of hands held too tightly, or in the bride's eyes cast low as the cloth cinched shut. Yet once bound, even such unions were law, for the witnesses had seen, and the law cared little for hidden hearts. When the cloth was finally removed, the act lingered, its power lasting beyond that hour. For though their hands were free again, the bond remained. From that day forward, what was hers was his, and what was his was hers, shared not by whim but by oath, and by the knot that had been tied before kin, gods, and hearth. Thus, the binding of hands was not a small rite tucked within the greater feast. It was the moment when two paths, once separate, were tied into one road, and as the people cheered, as the torches flared, the couple stood hand in hand, knowing that law, luck, and lineage now flowed through them both, as inseparably as the knot that had once fastened their palms. Seats of honour and the bragaful were not small details of a Viking wedding, but the very bones upon which the feast stood. To the outsider, a hall filled with smoke, laughter, and clattering horns might seem chaotic, but beneath the noise lay order sharper than any blade. Where one sat, who rose to speak, who held the horn first, all carried weight enough to shape alliances, spark feuds, or bind men to promises they dared not break. When guests entered the longhouse, they did not sit where they pleased. The benches had been prepared days before, scrubbed and strewn with fresh straw, with the high seat reserved like a throne. The groom took that place, sometimes with the bride beside him, sometimes opposite him across the fire, depending on custom and kinship. Closest kin and sworn allies flanked him, each placement a silent statement of loyalty and power. The bride's family, too, were honoured, given places near the heart of the hall, so all could see that her kin had not been cast aside, but drawn close. To sit lower down the benches was no shame, but everyone knew the order. A Viking man who found himself pushed too far from the high seat might brood over it for seasons, muttering that his honour had been slighted. The wise host balanced carefully, weaving kin, allies, and guests into a pattern as delicate as any tapestry. For a wedding was not only about man and woman, it was about binding families, about proving that the hall was strong enough to host and wise enough to seat with fairness. Once the feasting was underway, and bellies warmed with Viking food-ox roasted over fire, bread dark and heavy, fish salted and laid in bowls, there came the moment of the bragaful, the champion's toast. A great horn was brought forth, sometimes chased with silver, sometimes carved from bone, its rim shining in the firelight. It was filled to the brim with ale or mead, foaming as though it carried the breath of the gods themselves. The horn was handed first to the groom, who stood before all, raised it high, and swore. These were no idle words. The bragaful demanded vows, boasts, and obligations. A man might promise to defend his wife's kin as his own, to raid in the coming season and return with silver, to build a hall greater than his father's, or to uphold the laws of his people. The bride, too, could speak, pledging to guard the keys at her belt, to honour the hearth, to bind the families together in peace. Once the vow was spoken, the horn was drained, and in that act the promise was sealed. To drink was to bind oneself before all who listened. The horn then passed from hand to hand, each warrior, farmer, or kinsman rising to give his own toast. Some spoke of loyalty, some of vengeance yet to be taken, some of dreams for voyages across the sea. A Viking child might laugh at the boasting, not knowing that in this hall such words carried the force of destiny. For to boast and fail was to court shame, and no man wished his name sung as an oath-breaker. Thus the hall roared with vows and laughter, with the clash of horn against table and the shouts of witnesses. Seats of honour gave structure, the bragaful gave fire, and together they made the wedding feast more than a meal. They made it a forge where words turned to bonds, where men bound themselves as surely as the bride and groom had been bound. And, as the horn circled, its mead spilling in golden drops upon the floor, the gods themselves were thought to listen, nodding as another union, sealed in drink and oath, joined the tapestry of the Viking world. Gifts that bind the fjord were never trifles wrapped in ribbon, but heavy with meaning, weight, and obligation. In the Viking world, a gift was never free. It tied giver to receiver with invisible cords of honour and duty, cords as binding as oaths sworn at the thing. At weddings, when two clans sought to braid their fates together, the exchange of gifts was as important as the feast or the blessing, for it proclaimed that the union was more than flesh, and promised it was wealth shared, honour pledged, and loyalty sealed. The longhouse glowed with torchlight. as the gifts were brought forth. A Viking man might rise from his bench, cloak sweeping the straw, and place in the groom's hand a fine blade, its edge glimmering in the fire. This was not just steel, but trust. To give a weapon was to say, I arm you as I would arm my own blood. Should you falter, you shame me as well. The groom accepted with solemn nod, for he knew that to misuse such a gift would mark him in song as a man unworthy. Cloaks too passed across benches, heavy with fur, lined with bright dyes, or trimmed with embroidered bands. To lay a cloak on another's shoulders was to give warmth, shelter, and status. A Viking bride wrapped in such a gift was no longer only the daughter of her father, but now visibly embraced by her husband's kin. Each thread whispered of protection, each stitch a promise that she would not walk the fjord alone. Brooches and beads, delicate in form but mighty in meaning, often moved from women's hands to the bride. Oval brooches of bronze, polished smooth, were not mere adornment, but anchors of the apron dress, signs of her authority over the household. Amber beads, strung in gleaming loops, carried the sea's fire, believed to draw luck and ward off ill fate. When a mother-in-law clasped such treasures to her new daughter's dress, she gave more than jewelry. She handed down power, expectation, and a place among the women of the hall. But the finest gifts, the ones sung of longest, were blades. A sword laid across the benches, offered in front of all, was more than a weapon. It was the soul of a family, often passed down through generations, its hilt worn by hands long turned to dust. To entrust such a treasure to a new bond was to say that the marriage itself was as enduring as the steel. The receiving kin, in turn, might answer with silver arm rings, coins stamped from distant lands, or a chest of woven linen, ensuring that wealth moved both ways. For balance mattered, imbalance bred resentment, and resentment festered into feud. Children often watched wide-eyed as these treasures changed hands, the Viking child clutching at his mother's skirts, while whispering the names of weapons and brooches as if they were living beings. He knew, even then, that the hall's strength did not rest only on spears or ploughs, but on these rituals of giving and binding. By the end of the exchange, the hall was transformed. Each man who had given was now tied to the new household. Each woman who had bestowed jewelry or cloth was invested in the bride's fortune. Gifts were the fjord's true bridges, spanning not only the cold waters between farms, but the harsher currents of pride and rivalry. Thus, when the feasting horns lifted once more, the hall did not feel like two clans sitting warily side by side, but like one body newly stitched together, its seams of gold, steel, and fur gleaming in the firelight. For it was known to all, words might falter, oaths might be broken, but gifts bound the fjord, and no Viking dared sever such bonds without paying the price in blood. The feast, from hearth to high seat, was the roaring heart of every Viking wedding, the place where kinship was tasted, tested, and declared in flesh, bread, and drink. Long before the first horn was raised, the fires had been kindled, spits turned, and cauldrons hung. The air grew thick with the smell of boiling sheep and roasting joints, fat dripping into flames and hissing like serpents coiled on the hearth. Even before the bride and groom took their seats, bellies rumbled and tongues itched, for the feast was not only about filling the stomach, it was about proclaiming order, rank, and the strength of the house that dared to host. At the centre of the longhouse, the high seat stood ready, carved wood gleaming in the firelight, wolfskins draped across it, a seat worthy of chieftains and their brides. From there the groom looked down the benches, where kinsmen, allies, and neighbours pressed shoulder to shoulder. No one sat at random. A Viking man of honour found himself closer to the hearth, while men of lesser standing drifted further down the smoke-dark rafters. The bride's kin were given places of dignity, for to seat them poorly was to invite whispers, feuds, and the slow rot of insult. A Viking child, clambering on a mother's lap, saw the order set in stone. Here is power, here is respect, here is the shape of the world. When the food was brought forth, it came in courses like a tide. Great cauldrons of boiled sheep were ladled into bowls, meat soft enough to fall from bone, steam curling through the hall. Roasted joints of pork and beef followed, carved at the benches by men chosen for their steadiness and strength. To carve was no idle duty, it was an honour. A host who trusted you with the blade proclaimed you worthy of serving the hall itself. Bread, coarse and dark, was passed in heavy loaves, broken and shared without ceremony, while bowls of skyer, thick and sharp, cooled tongues seared by smoke and meat. The drinks, though, carried the true fire. Mead and ale, brewed in the weeks before the wedding, were ladled into horns and cups, their golden froth shining in the torchlight. Horns moved first to the high seat, where the groom and bride drank, sealing once more their bond before all eyes. From there the horns travelled down the benches, rank by rank, each man raising his portion before drinking deep. The order mattered. To skip a man was insult, to delay was slight, to spill was shame. Toasts punctuated the meal, loud enough to shake the rafters. A champion might rise and call on the gods. Another might boast of raids to come, while yet another swore vengeance against an enemy clan. Each vow spoken over mead was no idle jest. It was obligation, heavy as iron, binding as law. Laughter and song followed, but always the eyes of the hall marked, who drank boldly and who faltered, who carved well and who stumbled. By the time the last joints were stripped and the final horn drained, the feast had done its work. Stomachs were full, ranks were made visible, and the new household stood proclaimed in roasted flesh, steaming bowls and golden mead. From hearth to high seat, the hall pulsed with unity, as if the very gods themselves had feasted beside the people. For in the Viking world, no wedding was truly sealed until meat had been carved, ale had been drained, and honour had been tasted in every mouth. Songs, scolds, and slighted egos could make or break a Viking wedding feast, for while meat filled the bellies and ale burned in the throat, it was the scolds and singers who stirred the spirit. Words were weapons as sharp as steel, and in a hall filled with kin, rivals, and neighbours, one misplaced verse could echo longer than the clang of an axe on shield. A Viking wedding without song was no wedding at all, but song was never gentle, it was fire, and fire could warm or consume. The skald rose when the benches were heavy with food, and the air thick with smoke. His harp or lyre, sometimes no more than a stringed board, rang out like the voice of the Norns. First came praise verse woven for the groom, calling him wolf slayer, gold giver, sea rover. The bride, too, was honoured, compared to Freya in her beauty, her hair likened to ripe fields of barley, her hands to the keepers of hearth and kin. A Viking man leaned forward to catch each word, for in praise there was power. What the skald spoke became part of the memory of the hall. But praise was only the beginning. After mead horns circled and voices grew louder, the sharp sport of flighting began. One man, often emboldened by drink, would hurl a taunt, half in jest, half in challenge. Another would answer, his tongue cutting quicker than any blade. The hall roared with laughter as reputations were tested like shields in battle. A Viking child clutched at his mother's cloak, eyes wide as insults flew across the benches like arrows. He learned early that words, once spoken, could strike deeper than spears. Yet flighting was perilous. To call a man coward, oath-breaker, or knee-thing before witnesses was to brand him with shame he might not bear. More than one feast had turned sour when a tongue slipped too far. Knives flashed, benches overturned, and what began as sport ended in blood. Hosts feared this, for a wedding was meant to bind families, not split them with feud. Still, to silence the flighting altogether was dishonour. It showed weakness, as though the hall lacked men bold enough to defend their names with words. The skald knew how to steer the storm, Between barbs he wove verse to ease tempers, praise to smother insult, humour to turn anger aside. A clever poet could make rivals laugh at their own expense, turning fury into roaring mirth. But not all skalds were so skilled, and a careless rhyme could fan embers into flame. As the night deepened, voices rose together, less in rivalry and more in unity. Drinking songs filled the rafters, some bawdy, some solemn, all loud enough to reach the gods. Men thumped the tables, women clapped, children shrieked, and dogs howled until the hall seemed to shake upon its very beams. Yet in every ear lingered the sharper lines, the boasts made, the taunts delivered. A Viking wedding might be remembered for its feast or its gifts, but often it was the songs bright with honour or darkened with insult that endured in memory. For in the north, words were no fleeting breath. They were weapons, treasures, curses, and blessings, all at once. And at the wedding feast, when skalds sang and egos clashed, words became the true measure of a man. Games, trials, and friendly fights were as much a part of a Viking wedding as the feast itself, for no hall could contain the energy of men filled with meat, mead, and pride. Once the songs had been sung and the braggerful toasts made, the benches groaned under the restless weight of warriors and farmers alike. A Viking man was not content to let words alone display his worth. He needed strength, skill, and daring to be proven before his kin. And so the yard became the second hall of the wedding, where contests flared beneath the sky, fierce and joyous, yet always trembling on the edge of blood. The most common was wrestling. Two men, stripped to their tunics or bare-chested, stepped into the circle, the ground stamped firm by eager feet. Arms locked, muscles straining, they heaved and twisted, while the crowd shouted, clapped, and roared. A Viking child perched on his father's shoulders watched eyes wide, learning what it meant to be strong, learning how men carried honour not only with the sword but with the body. Sometimes the wrestlers ended in the mud, laughing and clasping each other's arms. Other times they rose sullen, pride bruised as badly as their ribs. Then came tug ropes, a game that was no less fierce. A thick rope, often salted with seawater to give it grip, was stretched between two sides. Kin against kin, sometimes bride's family against groom's, pulled with every sinew, heels dug deep into earth. To fall was no shame, but to let go was. The rope burned hands, and when one side toppled, they collapsed in heaps, bruised but laughing. Yet, if the match pitted clans with uneasy peace between them, even a tug of war could leave men glaring across the rope as though it were the fjord itself dividing them. Horses, too, were shown and praised. A groom eager to boast might lead his best stallion into the yard, its mane combed, hooves polished with fat, its strength paraded before all. Others followed, each Viking man keen to prove his beast the better. Sometimes wagers were cast, sometimes challenges made, and the horses were raced or set against each other in fierce displays of spirit. The crowd roared at every lunge and leap, for the strength of a horse spoke of the strength of its master. A bride, watching from the benches, might smile, for her husband's wealth and standing were measured as much in horseflesh as in silver. And then came the friendly fights. Blunted weapons, wooden staves, or simply fists, men squared off to prove valour. These were meant as sport, yet no one forgot that every blow struck also struck at pride. A jest gone too far, a swing too fierce, and laughter could harden into snarls. It was a thin line between sport and feud, and hosts prayed the gods would keep the day free from bloodshed. Still, to forbid such contests was unthinkable. It would shame the hall and rob the wedding of its fire. When the dust settled and the bruises darkened, men returned to the hall, boasting of their victories or excusing their losses. Children mimicked the wrestling in the straw, women rolled their eyes at battered husbands, and the skalds tucked the day's matches into memory for future verse. These games were more than pastime. They were the forge, where strength was tested, honour displayed, and rivalries tempered. For in the Viking world, joy was never gentle. It was fierce, physical, and edged with danger. At a wedding, when kin and strangers gathered together, that joy burned brightest in the games, trials, and friendly fights that filled the yard with shouts and laughter, and sometimes with the first sparks of feud. The bridal bed and the public private was the final, hushed stage of a Viking wedding, when laughter dimmed and torches flickered low, yet the weight of the gathering still pressed close. For in this world, the bond of man and woman was not complete with feasting or songs, nor even with oaths before gods and kin. It reached its seal only in the bed, where flesh joined flesh, and what was spoken in the hall was made binding by the body. As the feast waned, the bride was led toward the chamber, or in poorer farms, toward a curtained space at the end of the longhouse. Sometimes she walked proudly, her new keys clinking at her belt. Other times she was carried, lifted by kin or husband, laughter and jests following her through the smoky dark. A Viking child, still half awake in a corner, might hear the noise and not understand, but the adults knew. This was not merely ritual, but law and honour being carried across the threshold. In older days, when pagan rites still filled the fjords, the moment was less private. Torches or lamps were borne into the room, witnesses sometimes standing at the edge, murmuring prayers or scattering herbs for luck. The priest or gothy might bless the bed, laying Thor's hammer across it to shield against spiteful spirits. There are tales in the sagas of kin crowding near, insisting that eyes must see, ears must hear, to confirm that the bond was no sham. Consent had been spoken in the hall, but consummation was its proof. A marriage without it could be challenged, annulled, or mocked as hollow. Yet modesty crept into the north with time. As Christ's priests spread across the land, the ritual softened. Fewer witnesses stood by, fewer torches burned in the corner. Still, the people whispered that a wedding night without union was no wedding at all, no matter how many priests muttered Latin over the couple. A Viking man, no matter how proud in battle, could find his honour undone if gossip claimed his bride lay untouched. A Viking woman, too, knew the peril of such whispers. Her worth as keeper of hearth and bearer of heirs could be cast into doubt if the bond remained unsealed. The bed itself was often prepared with care. Furs were laid thick, wool blankets stacked high, herbs scattered for fragrance and for warding. In richer halls, carved bed frames gleamed with runes and beasts. In poorer ones, a simple pile of straw and skins sufficed. Yet in either case, it was sacred ground, the place where two households became one. The torches dimmed, the noise outside softened, but all knew what it meant when the couple withdrew. And though the act was private, its consequences were public. In the morning, the bride was expected to rise, no longer maiden, but wife. The keys at her belt ringing truer, her place in the household secured. The groom, if he emerged with pride and laughter, carried new weight among men, for he had proven the bond with more than words. Should doubt ever rise in the years to come about inheritance, land, or honour, witnesses of that night might be called to speak. Thus the bridal bed lay at the crossroads of public and private, laughter and silence, flesh and law. It was the last oath of the wedding, spoken without words, yet heard by gods and men alike. And in that union, as the torches burned down and the hall hushed, a new household was born, destined to carve its place into the saga of the Viking world. Morning gift at dawn was more than a token left at a bride's side. It was the mark of her standing, the assurance of her place, and the seal of her husband's word. In the Viking world, where wealth was measured in cattle, silver, and land, and where a woman's fortune could rise or collapse with the choices of men, the morning gift was no trifle. It was given when the wedding feast had faded, when the torches had burned to ash, and when the bridal bed had sealed the bond. With the first light of dawn spilling across the longhouse rafters, the new wife received the promise that her labour, her body, and her honour would not go unguarded. A Viking man who woke at dawn beside his bride did not rise empty-handed. In his keeping was the gift Morgengifu that bound him not only to her, but to her kin and to the gods who watched. Sometimes it was silver weighed heavy in a pouch, stamped coins from distant markets, or arm rings broken and shared. More often, it was land fields tilled by his fathers, meadows grazed by his herds, or rights to wood and water. In the eyes of the law, this gift was hers, not his. No husband could reclaim it, no kinsman could snatch it, for it was meant to keep her secure, even if fate left her widowed or cast her adrift. In the dim hush of morning, when smoke still curled from the embers, and the hall lay strewn with weary sleepers, the gesture carried weight beyond gold. To hand over keys to a chest, to press silver into a palm, to name land before witnesses, these acts told the hall that the woman now held her own portion of fortune. She was no beggar beneath her husband's board, but mistress of wealth in her own right. A Viking child peering from a bed of straw might see his mother's hand close over the gift, and learn that women, too, bore power, not in sword or shield, but in the strength of household and inheritance. Saga tales speak of women who guarded their mourning gifts fiercely. Some wielded the land they received to anchor their children's futures. Others traded their silver for alliances, lending weight to kin when feuds rose like storms. The gift was not only personal, it was political. A husband who gave richly displayed his wealth and honour to the whole fjord, while one who gave poorly whispered shame into every corner of the hall. To slight the mourning gift was to slight the bride herself, and such insult could fester into feud. The moment was solemn, but it was also tender in its own way. After the uproar of feast and games, after songs, wrestling and boasts, dawn brought stillness. The world outside was hushed, the frost, or sea mist, soft upon the fields. And within the hall, a bride held the proof that she was no longer only daughter or sister, but wife, with wealth of her own. For the rest of her days, whether stirring Viking food over the hearth, guiding servants, or keeping the household keys, she carried that morning gift as shield and banner. Thus the morning after the wedding was not a fading of joy, but its quiet crown. In the giving of silver, land, or keys, the marriage was completed not just in flesh or feast, but in law and honour. The morning gift was dawn made solid, a promise that even when the fire of youth dimmed and the years weighed heavy, the bride would hold security and respect in her hands. And so the Viking world bound love, duty and fortune together in the first light of day. Moving farms, in-law politics, was often the true beginning of a Viking marriage. For the feast, the vows, and the morning gift were but preludes to the harsher stage of daily life. Once the laughter of kin faded and the smoke of the torches drifted into memory, the bride crossed a threshold, not only of timber, but of fate. She left the farm of her fathers and stepped into the soil of another household, there to carve her place among strangers who were now kin by law, but not always by affection. It was no small thing for a Viking woman to move farms. She carried more than her chest of linen, wool or trinkets. She bore her dowry, her family's honour, and the watchful eyes of her husband's clan. When she stepped from the boat onto a new shore, or walked the worn path into the yard of her husband's hall, she carried the weight of two families' bonds. This was alliance embodied, the seal of peace between fjords, or the knot that bound trade across mountains. Yet within the farm walls, where goats bleated and smoke curled from the roof hole, she faced another battlefield, one made of glances, chores, and subtle words. The mother-in-law was often the first trial. She had once been the keeper of keys, the mistress of stores, the voice that guided servants and watched over hearth and livestock. To yield that role was no easy thing. Some did so with grace, welcoming the new bride, instructing her in the farm's rhythms, teaching her where the butter was churned thickest or which field bore the best hay. But others yielded grudgingly, guarding their influence like a sword, watching for every stumble. A Viking bride who fumbled with the brewing vat or misjudged the slaughtering season might find her mistakes recited at the benches, a sting sharper than any wound. Then came the steward, or the men of the household, who weighed the bride with careful eyes. Would she keep the farm's wealth safe? Would she waste stores or strengthen them? Would her words soothe quarrels or spark feuds? In a world where every hand mattered, her skill at spinning wool, her sense of order in the dairy, her ability to portion Viking food at the feast, all were measured as signs of her worth. A Viking man might be honoured for his sword, but a Viking woman's honour lay in her command of the house. And yet, beneath the quiet trials, the politics of farms ran deeper. A bride was not only wife, but envoy of her bloodline. When disputes arose, her words might soften her husband's temper or fuel it. When kin visited, she was the bridge that turned feasting into alliance rather than insult. She was watched as much as she watched, and in every glance, every portion served, the weight of her birth and her new bond was judged. Still, many sagas speak of women who mastered this dance, who turned suspicion into loyalty, and who wielded household power as firmly as any Viking man bore his axe. By crossing the farm threshold, they stepped into a new saga, not of courts and battles, but of hearth and hall, where politics were woven in bread, mead, and quiet counsel. For in the Viking world, a marriage was not merely two lives entwined, it was two farms, two clans, two destinies. And when the bride moved farms, she carried with her not just dowry and keys, but the fragile peace and power of an entire fjord. Second wives, frilla, and thralls brought a shadowed complexity to Viking marriage, for the bond between man and woman was seldom simple. Behind the laughter of weddings, the clatter of feasts, and the morning gift at dawn, there lingered the truth that a household could hold more than one woman bound to a man, and not always in equal station. The sagas whisper of jealous glances, of bargains struck in silence, of children who shared blood but not standing. In these quiet struggles lay the true fabric of Viking society, where honour, law, and necessity often tangled like nets in a stormy fjord. The most striking was the presence of second wives. Though Christian priests condemned it, in older days a Viking man of wealth or power might keep more than one woman under his roof. Such unions were not common in every farmstead, but were known among chieftains and jarls, where land, labour, and lineage demanded many heirs. The first wife held highest place, her keys heavy at her belt, her name etched in contracts. But a second wife, though bound by oath, walked a narrower path. She might bring her own dowry, yet she stood always in the shadow of the first, her children often measured against those born of the elder bond. Then there were the frilla concubines. These women, sometimes of free birth and sometimes taken in war or trade, lacked the sacred binding of bride price and mourning gift. Yet they were not without power. A beloved frilla could sway a man's ear, bear children claimed as his, and stir envy in the main wife's heart. Saga tales carry whispers of queens who burned with fury at the presence of rivals, and of concubines who schemed, using beauty and cunning to tilt the balance of a hall. Yet law drew lines children of frilla might inherit, but seldom with the same strength of claim as those of the wedded wife. Still, when fortunes waned and heirs died young, even a concubine's son could rise, setting brother against brother in feuds that spilled beyond the hall. The thralls lived in a harsher world still. Enslaved women were bound without choice, their unions often unrecognized by law, their children stamped with the same servitude. Yet even among thralls, bonds of love and loyalty grew, and masters sometimes allowed them to wed in their own manner. Some were freed in time, granted liberty as reward for years of service, and their children might climb into the ranks of free folk. But the mark of slavery lingered, and the whispers of origin could stain generations. To be born of a thrall, mother was to carry a burden heavier than chains. All of this unfolded beneath the rafters of the longhouse, where Viking food simmered in cauldrons. where children played on rush-strewn floors, where women wove wool and men sharpened blades. There, politics of intimacy played out as fiercely as battles on the field. The first wife guarded her status with steel in her voice. The friller sought favour with glances and gifts. The thrall bore her lot with quiet strength, her fate woven by others' hands. Thus Viking households were not simple hearths, but layered halls of power and rivalry. Marriage, concubinage, and bondage lived side by side, shaping inheritance, fueling gossip, and stirring feuds that outlasted lifetimes. Behind every proud Viking man stood not just one woman, but often many, bound in rank and rivalry, their stories carved less in runes than in the unspoken tensions of firelit rooms. And in that weaving of love, law, and loss lay the hidden saga of Viking unions, fierce and fraught, as tangled as the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Divorce in a world of oaths was as much a test of wit and restraint as weddings were of feasting and vows. In the Viking Age, the union of man and woman was bound not only by passion, but by contract, witnessed in halls, blessed at hearths, and sealed by the bridal bed. Yet not all bonds endured. When the weight of quarrels grew too heavy, when honour soured into insult, or when fates turned bitter, a Viking man or Viking woman might seek to sever the knot. But to part was perilous, for every oath unbound risked igniting feud, and every gift returned carried the sting of shame. The law did not blind itself to such endings. In the sagas we hear of lawful grounds for separation. A husband who withheld support, who squandered dowry, or failed to honour his wife with mourning gift might be cast aside. A wife who betrayed her vows, or who struck her husband before witnesses, gave cause for dismissal. But there were subtler reasons to cruelty, barrenness, or simple failure to keep a household whole. These were whispered of in the Thing, weighed by lawmen, and sharpened by the eyes of kin. For in a society built on honour, to remain in a broken union could be as dangerous as to break it. The act itself was both simple and heavy. A woman who sought to part from her husband was to stand at the doorway of their house before kin or neighbours and speak her declaration 3 times, "I part from you." Words spoken on the threshold, where inside met outside, carried power. The door was a liminal space, and there the oaths could be unbound. A Viking child, hearing those words, might not grasp the law, but he would feel the shiver in the hall, for the air itself seemed to pause when such final words were spoken. Yet the law also demanded balance. Dowry was returned to her kin, mourning gift remained hers, and any wealth she brought or gained must be reckoned. If cattle had been exchanged, if land had been granted, then stewards and kinsmen counted and measured, lest disputes spill into violence. For wealth was not only treasure, it was lifeblood, and to claim too much or return too little was to set the fjord whispering of greed. Still, even with lawful steps, divorces often burned with insult. To be cast aside was no small wound for a Viking man, and for a Viking woman, to walk back to her father's farm could feel like shame unless her cause was strong. Thus, kin gathered close to guard reputations, to soothe wounded honour, to ensure that parting did not fester into feud. Many sagas tell of families who failed in this task, where a simple declaration spiralled into bloodshed. Others speak of women like Gudrun, who left husbands with iron words and carved their names into memory with her boldness. Divorce did not mean dishonour if done rightly. A woman could wed again, a man too, and new bonds could be made. Yet the echo of parted oaths lingered, carried in gossip, in songs, in the quiet judgment of neighbours at the Thing. The law gave a path, but courage and caution were needed to walk it. In the Viking world, where oaths were the marrow of life, to break one was never light. Yet sometimes it was survival, and so divorce became its own kind of saga, grim, sharp, and edged with the hope that honour might endure even when love did not. Widows, widowers, and rematch carried a weight in Viking society that rivaled the force of wedding feasts themselves. Marriage was meant to weave two clans together, but death was never far from the hearth. A Viking man might not return from sea or raid, struck down by storm or sword. A Viking woman might die in childbirth, leaving her household adrift. In such moments, the fate of farms, children, and kinship ties hung in the balance. To lose a spouse was to step into a dangerous space between grief and necessity, where law, custom, and ambition all pressed their claim. For widows, the path was both burden and power. A woman who survived her husband often found herself in sudden command of his household. The mourning gift, secure in her name, gave her wealth of her own, while the keys at her belt marked her as keeper of the farm's stores. If she had sons, she ruled as their guardian until they grew, deciding when to spend, when to barter, and when to defend the land with axe or ally. If she had daughters, she bore the task of shaping their matches, weaving new bonds that could strengthen her own standing. Saga after saga speaks of such women, sharp-tongued, keen-minded, unafraid to strike bargains or stir feuds. These widows were not silent shadows. They were forces that shaped the course of fjords and families. But power brought peril. A wealthy widow was a tempting prize, and suitors circled quickly. Some came with gifts, some with threats, and some with blades. Remarriage was expected, yet not immediate. A period of mourning gave space for respect, but also for kin to guard her rights. Still, the sagas tell of widows who resisted hasty matches, who declared they would not wed again unless the suitor matched their worth. Such women held sway not only with wealth but with will, and their names are remembered more brightly than those of many Viking men. Widowers, too, bore their trials. A man who lost his wife often remarried swiftly, for the running of a farm could not rest long without a woman's hand at the keys. Children needed tending, servants needed guiding, and the hall demanded a mistress to keep order. Yet, even for men, the shadow of a lost wife lingered. If her kin believed she had been slighted in life or wronged in death, the widower might find his choices in new brides narrowed or his honour called into question at the thing. The politics of rematch were delicate. A new marriage could strengthen alliances, mend old feuds, or stir fresh rivalries. Wealth shifted with each union, and so did loyalties. Inheritance had to be guarded fiercely. Children of the first wife against those of the second. Property of the widow against claims from ambitious brothers-in-law. These were no small matters, for farms and fortunes could crumble if widows or widowers misstepped. And yet, in these tangled webs, widows often shone brightest. The sagas give them voices that cut through the noise of men, voices that brokered peace, spurred vengeance, or commanded respect in the hall. They remind us that, in the Viking world, death of a spouse did not silence the living. It gave them a sharper role to play, one where grief and power walked side by side, and where a woman or man, newly unbound, might shape the fate of kin for generations. In the world of oaths and feasts, of keys and swords, widowhood was not an end but a turning, and often, in that turning, the sagas found their fiercest figures. Crossings of faith, pagan to Christian, was not merely a shift in ritual, but a storm that swept across the Viking world, shaking the very ground on which marriages were made. For generations, weddings had been sealed with Thor's hammer laid on the bride's lap, with oaths spoken beneath the sky, with ale raised to Freya and Freya, gods of love and fertility. Yet, as the White Christ's priests strode into longhouses, bearing crosses instead of hammers, the old ways bent and, at times, broke. What had once been a feast of clan and gods became a battleground of faith, law, and custom, where the fate of Viking men and Viking women was decided not only by kin, but by church decree. In the older days, a wedding might be blessed with a blot, blood sprinkled from the halp bowl upon bride and groom, the gods invoked with chants to bind their fates. Kin gathered, gifts were exchanged, and vows were made before witnesses, their words as strong as any iron chain. The feast sealed the pact, and the gods were called to watch over the union. But with the spread of Christianity, such rites came to be scorned as heathen relics. Priests demanded that weddings be solemnized before church doors, the banns announced, and the union blessed with holy water. No longer was it enough for a Viking man to swear before neighbours at the thing. He must now swear beneath a cross, lest his marriage be denied legitimacy in the eyes of the new law. Law codes such as Gulathing and Gragas carved this shift into permanence. They decreed that marriages without priestly blessing could be struck down, that inheritances might falter if banns were not read, and that feasts aligned with pagan festivals were to be purged or reshaped into Christian holy days. Where once a couple might wed during winter nights, with offerings to the Vanir, they were now told to wed under saints' festivals, aligning their vows with the church's calendar. The shift was not gentle, it was a slow war of ink and edict, fought in the margins of law scrolls and in the hearts of men and women who clung to the old gods. Yet in the sagas, we see that the crossing was seldom clean. Some weddings bore both marks, Thor's hammer still hidden under the bridal bed, even as a priest muttered Latin prayers. A Viking child might grow up hearing both hymns and heathen songs at his parents' feast. Families balanced these worlds as best they could, for to resist outright risked fines or outlawry, but to abandon the gods entirely risked dishonour among kin who still carved runes beneath the stars. The transformation of vows was sharpest. Once, a man might clasp a woman's hand and declare, "I take you as mine, and you take me as yours." Now, the priest demanded clearer form, with words spoken not just to kin, but to God, sealing the union as sacrament rather than contract. The bride, once honoured with keys to the household, was now also bound under the gaze of church law, her rights reshaped, her role hemmed by commandments foreign to her foremothers. And yet, within this crossing, power stirred. Widows gained protection under Christian law that had not always existed under pagan custom. Children of second wives and concubines found their inheritance challenged, for the church scorned such unions as unlawful. Feast days were redirected, yet the ale still flowed, the songs still rang, and the spirit of community endured, though cloaked in new prayers. The Viking world did not cast off the old lightly. Even as priests blessed unions at church porches, somewhere in the shadow of the hall a hammer lay carved into wood, a quiet defiance. In the mingling of blot and banns, of ale and Eucharist, the Viking marriage became the stage where two worlds wrestled, and in that struggle a new age was born. Across the sea, Norse, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic neighbours, the wedding rites of Viking men and women did not stand alone, but pressed and mingled with the customs of those they traded with, raided, and sometimes married. The sea was no barrier, it was a road, and along it flowed silver, furs, slaves, and stories, and with them ways of binding man to woman. To step into a wedding hall in Hedeby or Novgorod, in Dublin or York, was to feel the tug of many worlds, where the hammer of Thor might lie beside a church cross, and where Slavic songs could rise in the same air as a scold's sharp verse. The Norse held tightly to their own marks of union, the keys given to a bride, heavy with the weight of household power, the hammer placed in her lap to stir the blessing of fertility, the ring oaths sworn before witnesses at the thing. These symbols were too rooted in their soil, too deep in saga and song, to vanish even when carried across the whale road. A Viking child, born in a foreign town, might still see his mother wear her keys upon her belt, a reminder that her word held sway within the walls of the home. The hammer, even when hidden, carried a whisper of protection, a defiance against foreign gods. Yet neighbours left their imprint. Among the Anglo-Saxons, where church bells tolled and priests demanded banns before the altar, Viking men who took brides often bent to Christian rites. The sagas recall such unions, uneasy but practical, where kinship outweighed stubbornness. There, gifts shifted too, less silver arm rings and more coin, less feasting of horseflesh and more bread blessed by priests. But still, the Viking spirit seeped in, boasts were made, mead was drunk, and swords were exchanged as tokens of trust, even beneath the cross. To the east, in the shadow of Slavic forests and rivers, the mingling grew more tangled. The Slavs bound unions with rites of fire, circle dances, and invocations to their own gods of harvest and hearth. A Viking man who wedded a Slavic woman might find himself standing by flames, his hand bound not only in oaths, but in garlands of grain. In these places, the Norse hammer might rest on a table beside carved wooden idols, neither side daring to cast away the other's power. The longhouses of Novgorod bore witness to these blended rites, where traders from many lands sat at one feast board, each claiming their god had blessed the union. What remained constant, even when customs mixed, was the weight of witness and word. Whether at a Slavic shrine, a Saxon church porch, or a Norse thing, marriage meant oaths spoken aloud, kin bound together, and feasting that carried news of the union far beyond the hall. The forms shifted, but the heart remained. Alliances, property, and honour, sealed by bread, drink, and word. The Viking world was never sealed in iron. It was a weave, threads of north and south, east and west, crossing upon the loom of trade and conquest. Weddings showed this most clearly. Distinct marks endured the bride's keys, the hammer, the ring oath, but around them swirled new prayers, new songs, new signs of blessing. In the mingling of these ways lay both the strength and the restlessness of the Viking age, never still, always crossing, always binding old roots to new soil. Craft, trade, and the bride box carried a weight far beyond ornament, for in the Viking world a marriage was not sealed by oaths alone, but by what a woman carried into her new life. A Viking man brought his bride price, his sword, his farm, and his kin's reputation. But a Viking woman came with her chest, and within it lay not trinkets, but the tools of survival. To open a bride box was to glimpse the future of a household, for inside were looms, linens, combs, thread, and the quiet promise of labour that kept fires burning when swords were sheathed. The chest itself was no simple box. Carved from oak or pine, its sides sometimes bore the marks of beasts or knotwork, a touch of beauty in a hard world. Iron fittings held it fast, and a key often worn by the bride herself meant more than entry into wood and hinges. It was the symbol of her authority, her right to manage the stores, to command the servants, to measure the grain and the ale. When a Viking child tugged at his mother's skirt and heard the rattle of keys at her belt, he knew she was keeper not just of food, but of order. Linens were among the most prized offerings. A bride who brought finely woven cloth into her husband's hall lifted the standing of his household at once. Linen was wealth, its fibres drawn from labour that stretched across seasons. A bolt of fine cloth could buy cattle, settle debts, or honour guests at the feast. To weave well was no small task, and sagas praised women whose skill at the loom rivalled the cunning of warriors in battle. A bride's box heavy with woven goods told her new kin that she was not idle, that her hands could clothe the hall and trade with merchants who prized such wares as much as silver. Nor was it only cloth. The chest often held combs of bone, spindle whorls, needles of iron, and pots of dye. These were the instruments of a craft that kept a Viking man and his kin clothed through winter, coloured their cloaks for feast, and gave them goods to barter across the sea. A spindle whorl might look small, but in it was the thread that bound farm to fjord, hearth to hall. To bring such tools was to declare, "I will not only eat of this household, I will sustain it. Even carved trinkets or jewellery in the chest bore meaning. A brooch, though small, could pin a cloak and display wealth. A drinking horn, finely made, spoke of generosity in feasting. These were tokens that marked a woman's kin as generous and her future as well provided. The more carefully chosen the bride box, the greater the honour to her family and the brighter her welcome into another's hall. In this way, craft was power. A Viking man might fight with steel, but a Viking woman wove the fabric of survival itself. Her box was not only a gift, it was a statement. That her hands could work, her kin could provide, and her presence would strengthen the farm into which she stepped. In a world where winter bit hard and hunger stalked the unwary, a well-filled bride box was more than dowry. It was life itself, packed into wood, locked with iron, and carried across the threshold as the surest promise of all. Feud, fine, and wedding as treaty was the sharpest edge of matrimony in the Viking age, for a wedding was never only about two people joining hands. It was a bond struck between families, a line drawn across the ash of feuds, a treaty carved in ale, and oaths rather than steel. To understand a Viking marriage is to see not only the bride's veil and the groom's sword, but also the blood spilled in years before, and the debts simmering like coals beneath the soil. In a land where vengeance was law as much as custom, feuds could smoulder for generations. A Viking man slain in the pasture, a Viking child wronged by theft, or a Viking woman dishonoured these wounds called for redress. Silver fines might be paid, cattle driven across fjords in compensation, yet often such payment was not enough to quench the rage of kin. Blood called for blood, unless something greater could be offered. And so, marriage became the highest coin, the surest bond. Picture two families, their dead buried beneath turf, their swords still sharpened for war. Yet at the thing, before witnesses and law speakers, one side offers a bride, the other accepts. The munder, the bride price, is not only silver, it is the price of peace. When the girl is led into her new husband's hall, she carries not only her keys and dowry, but also the hopes of clans weary of slaughter. Her body, her future children, her new loyalty, these become the living pledge that feud will not rise again, or if it does, it will strike through her own bloodline. The sagas whisper of such unions. A daughter of one chieftain married into the house of his sworn foe, her smile concealing the weight of generations of hate now pressed into her lap. Sometimes peace held, and the fields grew green again, the memory of feud softened by shared grandchildren running between farms. But sometimes suspicion remained. If a Viking man stumbled drunk and boasted of past killings, or if a Viking woman whispered too sharply of old wrongs, the fragile bond could shatter and blood would flow once more. Weddings could also settle debts that silver alone could not cover. A man bankrupt from fines or poor harvest might give his daughter as part of repayment, her dowry serving as both gift and pledge. In such cases, the marriage was both contract and captivity, for the girl had little say, yet the weight of the bond was undeniable. To take her was to wipe a slate clean, to carry debts into the shared future of the hall. Land, too, shifted through wedding feasts. Borders, marked by stone or stream, could be blurred by bloodshed. But a union between families turned those same borders into inheritance. A bride crossing a threshold was not only a wife, she was a bridge. Through her, her husband's sons could lay claim to acres once held by her father, binding the earth itself with the bond of marriage. It was a gamble, always. A feast might end with laughter and clasped hands, or it might break with angry boasts and knives flashing in torchlight. But when it worked, when vows and gifts held true, a wedding was the most powerful treaty a Viking world could forge. It bound men better than parchment, tied clans stronger than chains, and left behind heirs who carried both bloodlines in their veins. In the sagas, where vengeance sings louder than mercy, these rare unions shine brightest not for love, but for the fragile peace they brought, peace that tasted sweeter than mead and more precious than silver. Legends, laughs, and dark omens lived in the smoky rafters of every wedding hall, for no Viking feast was complete without stories told between horns of ale, laughter ringing over benches, and whispers of ill signs carried on the wind. Weddings were not only oaths and gifts, they were stages where fortune and doom seemed to walk side by side, where a careless word or a shadow in a dream could set hearts trembling. A Viking man might leave the yard believing his new bond was blessed by the gods, while another, watching ravens circle, would mutter that misfortune already perched on the thatch. The skalds were the guardians of such moments, weaving laughter and fear into verse that carried through the hall. A skald could raise spirits when the mead soured, or silence quarrels with a clever line. One saga tells of a Viking child nearly toppling a cauldron of stew onto the bride's lap, disaster that might have sparked dark whispers. But the skald, quick as thunder, raised his voice. Even Freya's feast grows lively when new love enters the hall. Laughter roared, tension broke, and what might have been remembered as a bad omen became instead a jest retold for years. Yet not all omens were so easily turned. Dreams held weight, and if the bride confessed to seeing her veil torn or her hearth cold in the night before, old women would mutter of ill fate. A Viking woman might carve runes for luck onto her bridal chest, hoping to ward away shadows. Men, too, took signs seriously. A drinking horn cracked during the bregaful could draw silence as heavy as winter snow, for to some it meant the bond would not last. Cursed toasts were whispered of often. One tale tells of a groom who raised his horn too high, boasting he would sire sons greater than any born in the fjord. The horn slipped, ale splashed, and the crowd gasped. Within a year, his firstborn was taken by sickness, and neighbours remembered that night with grim nods. Such stories were passed from hall to hall, warnings stitched into the fabric of marriage law. But fortune too had its signs. To find a raven feather by the threshold was thought a blessing, Odin himself watching the match. To see a horse whicker softly when the bride crossed the yard meant her steps were sure her household to be strong. Even the simplest luck, clear skies, a hearth that smoked straight, or fish biting well the next day, became folded into memory as proof the gods smiled upon the union. Weddings thrummed with both laughter and dread because life itself balanced so precariously. A Viking feast was a shield against the dark, but also a reminder that the dark always pressed close. Skalds, omens, jokes, and dreams, these threads made the wedding more than ceremony. They made it story, and story endured longer than bread or mead. In the end, a Viking marriage was not just bound by law, but by the tale told of it, and whether that tale rang with joy or carried the shadow of a curse. What endures, keys, contracts, and community, was not written in ink or carved on stone alone. It lived in the rhythm of daily life, in the way a Viking woman's keys clinked at her belt, in the weight of a handshake before witnesses, and in the roar of a feast that gathered the whole farmstead together. Though centuries have passed since the smoke of Viking longhouses drifted over fjords, their weddings left marks that never truly faded, for they bound not only man to woman, but kin to kin, field to field, and neighbour to neighbour. The keys, simple in shape, yet heavy with meaning, were perhaps the clearest sign of endurance. When a bride crossed the threshold, the ring of iron keys placed in her keeping announced to all that she now stood as mistress of the stores. It was more than a symbol, it was authority made tangible. The chest of silver, the bins of grain, the curing meat, and brewing ale all fell under her command. A Viking child growing at her skirts would hear those keys and know that his mother's word ruled the household as firmly as his father's spear guarded the yard. That legacy of household power has echoed down through the sagas. a reminder that women were not shadows in the hall, but its beating heart. Contracts, too, endured not on parchment, but in memory and reputation. To swear before the thing, on the temple ring, or in the smoke-thick hall before gathered kin, was to weave one's word into the very fabric of the community. A Viking man who broke such an oath found no peace, for witnesses held him to account. A Viking woman who entered into a union knew her rights, her dowry protected, her morning gift promised. These were not idle customs, but laws shaped by survival, for in a land of hard winters and short harvests, broken promises could mean the ruin of entire households. To bind contracts in marriage was to bind the future of the clan itself. And then there was the feast. No Viking marriage was complete without the benches filled, the horns raised, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread thick in the air. The feast did more than feed it forged. At the tables, alliances were tested, gossip carried, quarrels smoothed or sharpened. The hall itself became a stage where honour was displayed, generosity proven, and the couple's bond made visible in the sharing of food and drink. A Viking man might measure his worth by his sword, but the people judged a household by the weight of its hospitality, and weddings were the finest proof of all. What endures, then, is not merely fragments of ritual, but the spirit behind them. That marriage was never private, never hidden in chambers, but public and communal, stitched into the life of the whole settlement. Keys gave women power, contracts gave structure, and the feast gave joy. Together, they created more than ceremony, they created society itself. And though the sagas tell of war and voyages, of gods and kings, it was in the glow of these weddings that Viking life found its truest strength. In vows witnessed, in bread shared, in community bound tighter than iron.